In this video, we're going to talk in more detail about file paths. File paths are directions you give to your project to connect the different files within it together. So far, we have been working with only a small number of files, all located at the same level in the project, in what is known as the root directory. The root directory is the folder in which all your project files are located. For a front-end project, it contains everything the project needs to run. However, in order to keep your projects well structured and organized, our different file types should be sorted into their own folders, which creates a tree of folders and files that our file paths need to navigate. Your HTML files should all be in the root directory, not nested inside other folders within it. To fit with industry standard, your CSS file and image files should be organized into an assets folder. The Assets folder goes into the root directory, and it should contain a CSS folder and an Images folder. The CSS file then goes in the CSS folder, and any image files you have go in the Images folder. Now, the CSS file for this project has some CSS to load a background image, and it has a backup background color of light blue set should the image file not load. But when we run the code, we can see that neither the background color or the background image can be seen. This tells us that the HTML file cannot find the CSS file when the page is rendered in the browser. So the file path we gave the HTML file in the head must be incorrect. As you will remember from previous lessons, the file path to the CSS file is defined in the href attribute. At the moment, the file path is the name of the CSS file, and we can see that this matches. So why isn't the CSS loading? Well, this file path says, from the location of this HTML file, the image file should be in the same folder. The folder the index.html file is in is the root directory, and the only things that can be seen directly from the root directory is the HTML file and the assets folder. There's no style.css file in it. So our file path needs to be adjusted. In order to get to the CSS file from the root directory, the file path first needs to go into the Assets folder. So let's add that to our file path. Then, from the Assets folder, it needs to go into the CSS folder. So let's add that to our file path too. Then from the CSS folder, the file path will be able to see the style.css file that we want to load. Now let's run the code and see if any CSS loads for us. Still not working. The reason for this is that file paths are case sensitive. I used a capital letter for my Assets folder name here in the file path, but the actual folder name is all lowercase, which incidentally is also industry practice. Don't use capital letters in your folders or file names. So I need to change my file path so that the names of my folders match exactly, including making sure it is all lowercase. Now when I run the code, I can see that the CSS to apply the background color is working. Great. But the background image is still not loading. Let's go look at the file path we have for the image in the CSS file. So here we have just the image file name, and we know that's not going to work. We know the image file is in the Images folder, so let's add that to the file path. And the Images folder is in the Assets folder, so let's add that too and run the code. The background image still isn't showing up, and the reason for this is file paths are like giving directions. They are different depending on where we start from. As this file path starts in the CSS file, the directions have to start from where the CSS file is in the file structure. We need to get from here to here. From the style.css file, we can't see anything else. Only the style.css file is inside the CSS folder. So the first part of our file path needs to say, go up out of the CSS folder and into the Assets folder. We do that with 2 full stops before a slash. Then, from the Assets folder, we can see the Images folder, which has our image inside it. So after ... we can add Images/, and then our image file name. Now let's run the code to check if that worked. Traversing our file paths takes practice, but it is an important skill to learn. If your files are not loading, the first things to check are your file structure and your file paths. There are 2 types of file paths we can use in our projects. One is relative file paths, which are like the ones I've just shown you. The other is absolute file paths. Absolute file paths are file paths that always start from the root directory. We start an absolute file path with a slash, and then the rest of the file path can be read from the root directory. So in my CSS file, I can adjust the file path here to an absolute file path. So let's start it with a slash, and then from there goes the assets folder, which is in the root directory, and then to the images folder, and finally to the image file. And when I run the code, we can see the image file is loading up. Absolute file paths work okay in Replit and also in Gitpod, which is the coding space we will introduce you to later that you will use to create your milestone projects. However, when you come to deploy your final projects into the web, the service that does this for you, called GitHub Pages, does not like absolute file paths. This is because of the way they structure the files you send them to render your project. So it is best to use relative file paths from the beginning to save yourself confusion later on when you come to deploy your milestone projects.